This webinar is sponsored by the Anabaptist Disabilities Network and Discipleship Ministries of the Church of the Brethren. And serving as the host tonight for this event is Jean Davies, who is the Executive Director of the Anabaptist Disabilities Network. And so, Jean, I will turn it over to you for further introductions and information, which, by the way, also remember, use the Q&A box for your questions or communication that you want to have with JE and Jean tonight. Thank you.
You're muted, Jean.
I'm muted. Thank you so much, Stan, and welcome everyone to A Small World, Building Resiliency and Hope After Childhood Trauma, presented by John Eric Mize, or also known as JE. JE serves as the secretary of the ADN Board of Directors and as a field associate. He lives in Goshen, Indiana, where he works as a licensed clinical social worker. Some of his favorite people in the world have experienced mental illness, and he views their presence in our church communities as a true gift. He's a member of Waterford Mennonite Church, where his wife Katie serves on the pastoral team. JE, thank you so much for being with us tonight and being willing to share your time and your wisdom with us. If you have questions during JE's presentation, please feel free to type those in the chat. We'll probably be saving those for later. We'll have a little bit of a break midway, and we'll have some time at the end where JE will be answering questions. I also want to let you know that this is recorded. So if your question is of a confidential nature, you may want to email that to us later rather than put that in the chat. So JE, thank you for being here, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Jean, and thank you all to showing up here and dedicating an hour of your time to be with us, to be with ADN, and to learn a little bit more about trauma. I'm going to pull up the screen here, share it with you all as we walk through this presentation together. And so the title of the presentation is called A Small World, Building Resiliency and Hope After Childhood Trauma. You have right there my name, my credentials, email address, phone number if you need to get a hold of me at any time after this. So glad that you're here. As we get started, I want to recognize that talking about trauma can be difficult for people. And so my first priority for you is to take care of yourselves in this time. If you find yourself feeling overwhelmed or things start stirring up inside of you, please take care of yourself. If you need to step away, get a glass of water. If you need to lay down, everybody's face isn't showing right now. So if you need to jump around and dance, you can do that too. So whatever allows you to just be safe and be where you are, feel free to do that. As we get started, I also want to start with just a couple grounding skills and tools as we get going. So if you do feel stuck along the way and you'd still like to participate and engage, maybe these will be opportunities for you to be able to do that. And these are skills that are available for people who have experienced trauma as well. And so if you're working with people who have experienced trauma, if you yourself have experienced trauma, these might be tools that could be helpful as a grounding exercise for you. So here's a couple skills to start. The first one that we're going to do is one of my favorite skills. It's very, very simple. It's the easiest and simplest mindfulness exercise that a person could do. It is called 2 feet and 1 breath. And so we're going to try practicing this together. So wherever you are, if you're in a seated position or a standing position, that could work too. Make sure that you put both feet firmly on the ground. You don't have to dig yourself in, but just allow yourself to know that your feet are present and stable on the ground. Wiggle your toes if you got to. And I like to put one hand on my chest as well as I do this exercise, just as a reminder of a compassionate touch for myself and a reminder of that I'm present, that I'm here. And so collectively, let's just do one deep breath together, breathing in and out. And there we are. That's 2 feet, 1 breath. Another exercise that we're going to do as we get going is hand breathing. Now, this is an exercise that I like to do. I like to put my hand kind of in front of my face, and you could also put it down to your side as well if that works for you. But to show you all what this is, I'm going to put my hand out, and we're going to practice as we breathe in, as we inhale, tracing our finger up. And then as we exhale, tracing down each finger on our hand. So breathing in and out, in and out, in and out, in, last one, and out. All right, so that is hand breathing. You're welcome to practice any of those throughout this time together or on your own if you find them helpful. If you don't find them helpful, we'll try another skill as we go on here in a bit. So we are talking about trauma tonight, but why exactly are we talking about trauma? What is the relevance of talking about trauma from a perspective of disabilities, from a perspective of just people going about in this world, church members, church leaders? Why do we talk about it? A couple of reasons. One, over half the people you encounter have lived at least one traumatic experience as a child. Some studies show as high as 80% of people have encountered traumatic experiences just as a child under the age of 18. So most of the people you encounter will have experienced trauma in their lives, whether it's at work, at church, at schools, wherever you might be. You will likely encounter somebody who's experienced trauma. Maybe it's you. Another thing to note is trauma affects all demographics without prejudice. So a lot of the studies have shown that just because you're a certain age, race, or socioeconomic status, it doesn't mean that you are immune to the impact of trauma. There might be some demographics that might have experienced compounded traumas, but it affects all demographics without prejudice. And another note is that early childhood trauma can have a lifelong negative impact. And we'll get into that a little bit more later as we go on. So when we're talking about trauma, what are we talking about? What exactly is trauma? So when we're talking about trauma, what we're really doing is exploring a series of other questions. The base definition of trauma is an experience that leaves someone stuck in a state of helplessness or overwhelm. So there's a wide range of experiences that might cause this type of sensation, such as witnessing or experiencing an act of violence, sexual abuse, a natural disaster, or a significant loss. However, some people may encounter these events and not experience particularly traumatic experience at all with this. So just because you've encountered one of those traumatic events doesn't mean that you have had any sort of trauma-like responses associated with that. And likewise, some people may experience trauma without ever having encountered any of these specific types of events. So trauma is not just having experienced a certain type of event, and it's not just having a certain type of outcome of these either. So when we're talking about trauma, we're really talking about 3 different aspects. What we're talking about is the event itself. As mentioned in the last slide, there are multiple types of events or long-standing events that can trigger a traumatic experience or reaction, such as abuse, neglect, things like that, accidents, But it's not just that, because some of the research that we've discovered is that, for example, if we took a platoon of soldiers, say 20 soldiers, we put them into a battle. At the end of that battle, although they all encountered basically the same thing, they were at the same place at the same time. Of those 20 soldiers, 5 statistically would develop PTSD as a result of that event. So why not the other 15? Or why just those 5 out of those 20 would develop symptoms associated with PTSD? Because although the event is being experienced by all, it is not being experienced the same by all. So trauma is not just the event, but it's also the perception as well. So how we view the event, how the event impacts the way that we view ourselves and the world around us is also part of what makes something a traumatic experience and allows us to experience some of these traumatic responses. What leads to this perception? Why do these 5 particular soldiers who were in this platoon experience PTSD? Some factors may be at play, such as biological vulnerability or genetic predisposition, or particular encounters associated with the event, such as relationships or actions or non-actions. But the primary universal factor associated with this is that people who develop PTSD later in life tend to have adverse childhood experiences. And so one other aspect of the development of trauma that we know is the storage, how these traumas get stored into our brain, because they get stored a little bit differently than regular memories get stored in our brain. So let's look at how these memories tend to be stored in the brain in order to get a more complete picture of what trauma is. So triggers. These are how traumas are stored. Trauma memories make a unique imprint on our brains. For those of you who are alive and old enough, think back to the date September 11th, 2001. You might have vivid images or memories connected to that day. Where you were, who you were with, when you found out that information. Now let's try to go back one day further to September 10th, 2001. What were you doing that day? You may have some recollections, but some of it might actually be pretty vague. You might remember nothing at all about that day. For me, it was my birthday, and I didn't even recollect much of anything about that day. But I do specifically remember many of the events that occurred on September 11th. Why is that? Why can I remember the 11th, but not the 10th? Well, what happens is our traumas are stored as not as not as a narrative story with a simple beginning, middle, and end, but they're stored as sensory fragments, and they're kind of lodged within our hippocampus and our brains. And so we don't get a full picture of what's going on when we ever experience these traumas. And so what happens is, because there are these sensory fragments, we start to experience them as triggers. And so these triggers occur when we have sensory reminders of trauma events. And so these sensory reminders might look like smelling something that reminds us of the encounter, seeing something visually that reminds us of the encounter, hearing something that sounds like a part of our experience, like sirens or fireworks, that might trigger us to re-experience this event once again, where we get thrown back into that experience. People encounter triggers not as memories, but as if they are actually in the past experiencing that traumatic event. This is something that we sometimes refer to as a flashback. These encounters can sometimes be controlled, and sometimes they cannot. Sometimes we know the types of environments that might lead us to a trigger response. For example, someone who's been in war might know that the 4th of July with fireworks and all of that, they might know that those sounds might trigger an emotional or a traumatic response within them. And then other times there might be things like seeing the shape of the nose of someone that looks awfully similar to the person that abused you. That might be a trigger response as well. And it can occur suddenly and without intention. Now, the trick is that some of the most evidence-based treatment methods to address trauma involve an intentional triggering of these negative memories in order to reprocess and restore the memories back into the brain. And so in the process of treatment for people, it can often be really, really difficult because it involves an intentional re-triggering. However, we do not want to intentionally subject someone to a trigger without the support of a trained professional. So I just want to kind of add a little bit of caution there that we're not trying to control this without the support of people who know what they're doing. So we don't want to intentionally try to set people off or to trigger them. And it should be noted that sometimes these responses might be brief. It might be just a few nanoseconds, or it sometimes might be a situation that puts us in a dissociative state that lasts for hours or even days. So that is how trauma tends to work within us. And so before we get going and talking a little bit more, I do want to pause and I want to take a step back, and I want to remind ourselves of the skills that we've learned so far so that we can continue to reintegrate those skills. So the first one is 2 feet, 1 breath. So we'll practice this together. Go ahead and place both feet firmly on the ground. Then taking 1 deep breath in and out. And now engaging in our hand breathing once more. Let's try that. Breathing in and out. Tracing your hand as you go up. And exhaling as you go down. All right. And now we're going to try one more. This is an activity called tapping. This is a product of a type of trauma therapy called EMDR, eye desensitization, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And so what this looks like is fairly simple. You can either tap back and forth on your knees in a slow, gentle motion about once per second. And remember, you're not drumming, you're not trying to wail on your knees or anything like that. Or you can cross your arms like you're giving yourself a big hug, and then just tap gently back and forth on your shoulders. This is a process called bilateral stimulation. Bilateral meaning both sides, stimulating both the right and the left side of our body, which stimulates the right and left side of our brains. What this does is this activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which tells our body to rest and to be in a state of calm. So this is often used in connection with some imaginative exercises. So I'd like you to pause for a moment and identify a place, ideally a place that you've never been to before, that symbolizes or represents peace and calm for you. So maybe this is on a beach. Maybe this is a cabin in the woods, on top of a mountain. Whatever it is that represents peace and calm to you, standing by a stream. I'd like you to sink into that image a little bit. As you sink into that image, we're going to practice this tapping of back and forth, gently and slowly, left and right. And allow yourself to sink into that image and simply notice what it's like to be in that space. Notice the sights that you might see, color of the sky, color of the earth, the sand, the dirt, the grass, the snow beneath you. Notice if there are any other creatures, birds in the sky, squirrels rustling up a tree. Notice what smells you might encounter. So the salty smell of the air, fresh water of the stream. Notice what sensations you might encounter inside of your body or outside of your body. The sun against your face. Feel the wind on your skin. Your feet firmly planted into the ground. What sounds might you encounter? The rustling of waves, the wind against the trees. And notice what it might feel like inside of your own body. To be in a space of peace and rest and calm. You can allow yourself to be there as long as you'd like. You can stop whenever you're ready. Maybe it'll help to take a breath as you complete this exercise. Allowing yourself to just sit and be for a moment. So we're going to be moving forward now and talking about some of the intersectionality associated with trauma. But before we dive into that too far, I want to check and see if we have any questions. Are there any questions coming through in the chats or in the question and answer so far? I'll let you have a moment to just type those in if you'd like to ask a question in the chat or in the question and answer. If you don't have a question so far, then we can just go ahead and move forward. But I'll give you just a moment for that. All right, there'll be time for questions at the end as well. So feel free to ask your questions along the way, and we'll get back to those questions at the end of our time too. All right. So this is the Anabaptist Disabilities Network. And so I want to talk specifically about the intersectionality of disability and childhood trauma, because there's quite a merging of uh, those two population groups. And you can't really talk about disability without talking about childhood trauma, and you can't really talk about childhood trauma without talking about disability. They really, really go hand in hand. Some things to note is that individuals with disabilities are 4 times more likely to be victims of crime than the non-disabled. Um, Also worth noting that children on the autism spectrum are twice as likely to experience sexual abuse as those in the general population. And actually, females on the autism spectrum are 4 times as likely to experience sexual abuse as those in the general population. And we also know that stigma and marginalization in and of itself can be traumatic. So if you have encountered disability as a child, um, you might experience that whole event as being traumatic in and of itself. Um, and those with differing abilities have increased risk factors of experiencing trauma, as well as they might be more dependent on others. They have limited communication and emotional regulation skills. And within our society, they're just less likely to be believed when they share that they've experienced trauma or abuse or neglect. So much of what we know, the statistics of what we know, I'm sure just don't even scratch the surface of what the reality is. There's probably much more than we realize. Says abuse against children with developmental disabilities are 6 times less likely to be reported. 6 times. So what do we know about trauma? How does it impact children right from the start? There are some cues and some signs that we can pick up on that we might be able to notice. But sometimes this can be really, really tricky. So some signs of trauma in children are hypervigilance. So they might be more energetic, or they might be more nervous. Similarly, there might be signs of hyperreactivity, strong emotions, and acting out. What I find interesting is that those are often characteristics of children with ADHD or ADD, as they're often seen as being hypervigilant or hyperreactive, or just hyperactive. And so oftentimes there's a misdiagnosis in which we identify kids as being ADD or ADHD when we're missing some of the core signs of trauma. I heard today that there's been this shortage, as some of you might be aware of Adderall in our country. And one of the main reasons of that is that there's been a 15% increase of people reporting having experienced symptoms of ADD and ADHD in just the last few years. It was kind of an unexpected increase. Some people have been saying that, this is maybe noticing these symptoms for the first time in the midst of working from home and all that encounter during COVID. But there might also be something to the idea that what people have been experiencing over the last several years have been an impact of trauma. And some of the symptoms associated with that might look like ADD or ADHD. So sometimes it can be hard to kind of suss out the differences between those two things, but those are some of the core signs that we look for in children who have encountered trauma. Another thing that we note is attachment difficulties. So this can look a couple different ways. They might be quiet or distant in relationships with their peers, with adults, or they might become overly attached, overly connected to certain parents or certain people as a way of, creating safety in their lives. And so so attachment difficulties can be a part of this. Um, Oftentimes we associate people who have encountered trauma as people who are underachieving. We might look for people who are doing worse in school, or who are getting in fights in school, things like that. But there's also the reality that sometimes an impact of trauma is overachieving or over functioning. So it could be underachieving or under functioning, but it might also very well be the exact opposite. Some of these kids that are excelling in their grades, that are, look on the outside that they're having it all together, they're trying to kind of over function and piecemeal a safe existence outside of the trauma they've encountered. Um, and another reality of this is that there might potentially be no visible signs of childhood trauma that we can recognize. Oftentimes it just kind of slips underneath. And so so many times childhood trauma is unreported. Um, and Yeah, that's a difficult thing to acknowledge, that we can't always see the signs. And so so I just want to point that out also, that if you have a loved one that that you found out later has encountered trauma, um, it might not be, just because you weren't looking. They might have not been displaying the signs. And so don't beat yourself up. Please don't beat yourself up. Um, we're dealing with really delicate nuances here. Um, and so we can recognize that there are some immediate signs, immediate things that we can look for, but sometimes it is invisible. But we do know that there are some long-term impacts of trauma as well. There's a study called the ACEs study that was conducted between the years 1997 or 1995 and 1997. It had over 17,000 participants. It was one of the largest trauma studies ever conducted. And it was a simple 10-question questionnaire that measured 10 different types of childhood traumas. And in that study, we learned that nearly 70% of all participants in the study reported at least one adverse childhood experience, or ACE, out of the 10. So nearly 70% of people from this one study reported that that they were encounterers of trauma. Now, this first study that has since been replicated in many other ways was not conducted in a particularly diverse setting. It was conducted in primarily in white suburban California. And so that was the large majority of people who were reporting that they had at least one. The study was replicated in Philadelphia a couple of years later, and it said nearly 83% of participants had reported at least one adverse childhood experience. And so a couple things that we learned from this is that more childhood trauma leads to higher risks of health issues in adults. So, so if you have the greater number of traumas out of the 10 that you encountered, the more likelihood you have of encountering these other risks of health issues as an older adult. So children with more adverse childhood experiences were more likely later in life to have liver disease and heart disease. They're more likely to experience depression, to develop addictions to alcohol or other drugs. They were more likely to perpetuate domestic violence towards others. They were more likely to smoke cigarettes, have poor job performance, There are even indications that later in life they were more likely to develop Alzheimer's. So that's kind of another angle in which we can recognize that disabilities and trauma are so closely linked to each other, because people who have developed early childhood experiences are much more likely later in life to develop symptoms and outcomes associated with disabilities later in life, let alone the fact that trauma itself and the symptoms of PTSD can itself be debilitating. There's some evidence that childhood trauma can lead to the development of long-term disabilities that might restrict one's ability to work or to function within the societal bounds of normative expectations. And so again, trauma and disabilities are inextricably linked. Those with disabilities are more prone to experience trauma, and those who experience trauma are more prone to develop ongoing disabilities. Bessel van der Kolk, doctor, one of the premier scientists studying trauma, says, as the ACE study has shown, childhood abuse and neglect is the single most preventative cause of mental illness, the single most common cause of drug and alcohol abuse, and a significant contributor to leading causes of death, such as diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and suicide. This means that if we can work to decrease the risk of childhood trauma, it would be the most impactful action that we could make as a society to save lives, to reduce poverty, and to address disability. Paul Espius, another doctor, he says it this way. He says, ACEs are the new cholesterol. So what we used to say is, we should, find ways to address our cholesterol, because that is the single thing that's going to kill us. He's saying that actually the thing that could cause the most damage are adverse childhood experiences. And so we need to develop ways to address and respond to those on the back end and on the front end preemptively. How do we address adverse childhood experiences? And so how do we address childhood trauma? And one of the factors I want to focus on this evening is resilience. And this is a quote from Helen Keller. She says, although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of the overcoming of it. So as we look at this, at the many issues associated with trauma, I don't want to leave us with just focusing on the suffering that can be caused by trauma, but also on the many ways and the many people that have overcome the impacts of trauma, because it is not in itself a sentence to a certain way of life. There are ways that we as community and as individuals can work to support people in navigating the devastating impacts of trauma. And resiliency is a relatively new concept overall. It arrived on the psychological scene in about the 1960s. And resiliency, if we were to kind of create a definition for it, it's the ability to adapt or cope with adverse experiences and challenges. While we may not always be able to stop traumas from happening, there will always be things like accidents and bad actors in the world. We can increase factors of resilience to influence how trauma might be impacting individuals. If we go back to that screen earlier on what is trauma, it's the event, the perception, and the storage. And so while we might not always be able to stop the event from occurring, we might be able to find ways to change and navigate those perceptions. So that way it can be stored more narratively, more wholly in the brains. So what factors lead to the development of resiliency? How do we know? How do we how do we find ways to be resilient in our families, in our churches, in our communities. One such factor is having a supportive family. And so engaging in developing supportive family structures, we know that that's the biggest influence in a young person's life, but it's not the only influence. Having mentors, coaches, and teachers can be a huge way of addressing this. Having some of these things such as a positive family, peer relationships, active involvement in the community, and development of learned skills for emotional regulation, having all of these factors can reduce mental illness and suicidality by half if we have these resiliency factors. So another one is consistency or stability at home, making sure that people have food, shelter, someone to watch over them, and learn skills to manage the distress. So teaching these things at school, at church, one-on-one in a mentor relationship, learning how to navigate some of these distresses. And also we know hope and optimism can be a great influence. So we know that if a kid is optimistic, or if they have hope, if they have a purpose in their life, that can influence their ability to overcome some of the negative impacts that might be associated with trauma. So what can communities do to help increase resiliency factors for children and teens and young adults? So I have an acronym COPE, COPE, and the C is connect with resources. So churches and other community resources can partner with local primary care physicians, dentists, mental health professionals in order to increase access for those in need. There have been some research that indicates that having a doctor and a dentist can greatly reduce the negative impacts of trauma. I wouldn't have thought a dentist. I would have thought maybe a dentist would be a little bit, way of increasing the trauma in a kid's life, but maybe not. maybe there is something to that. And of course, access to mental health professionals as well. So it's helpful for churches and communities to have an idea of who to refer to and invite them to talk to children, youth, and families. So not just have a list of people, but have that list of people come into your world, come to the lives of families, introduce themselves, talk to them so that they know it's a safe place to go. Early intervention is such a powerful way to limit the impacts of trauma, and connecting people with resources is one way of making sure that we can get that early intervention as soon as possible. The next one is offering safe activities. Peer connection and mentorship is evidence-based. They're evidence-based tools to promote safety and stability in the lives of children and youth. Mentorship programs are actually recommended interventions by the CDC. So the development of a mentorship program can be as vital an intervention to the promotion of one's health as something like brushing one's teeth or eating their vegetables. It can be just as impactful, possibly even more. And so we can't really underestimate the impact of having mentors in people's lives as they navigate the potential impacts of traumatic experiences. The next thing that we can do is we can promote awareness. Trauma often lives in the shadows. Multiple times each week, I lead a group therapy intervention for adults. And one of the most impactful and transformative experiences that group members report to me is that they are learning that there are other people in the world that are like them and have those shared experiences. A couple times a week, I hear people say, "Me too. I know what you've gone through. I know what you're experiencing." And a light bulb just goes on, and they realize that they're not alone. And realizing that you're not alone is such a powerful tool when it comes to addressing trauma, because it often has this side effect of embarrassment or shame that we try to push away or push aside and not let people know. And when we can open the door, open the box, allow people to recognize that that trauma is here, it's among us. It's more than half the people in your pews every Sunday are experiencing, have experienced traumatic events in their lives. When we become aware of that, that can be such a powerful, powerful tool. So continue on your own to study the signs of trauma and the risk factors, to be aware if children or youth are starting to exhibit signs that they might have experienced trauma, so you can talk to them and promote that awareness as well. And the next thing I would say is empower youth. Let them speak up. They know what they need much more than we do, and empowering other people is one of those trauma-informed care activities that we can do, giving people a sense of autonomy, giving them a sense of voice, to share their stories, to be able to be supports in their community. This is what we can do. So being able to give back to their communities and find a sense of purpose can be some of the most significant resources of resiliency that youth and children can have. So I want to share these quotes as well as we wrap this up, and then I'm going to share a poem to close, and then we're going to leave the last 5 or 10 minutes or so for any additional questions or explorations that people might have. So this quote by Bessel van der Kolk says, "Having a supportive network constitutes the single most powerful protection against becoming traumatized." So when we are engaging as a community, when we are supporting each other, when we're supporting one another, that is one of the most powerful things that we can do for each other. And this task might seem really big, but even if you can't do everything, you can do something. Ralph Braun, sometimes known as the father of the mobility movement, said this. He says, "I am only one, but I am one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something. And I will not let what I cannot do interfere with what I can do." So my hope and prayer is that as you continue to process how trauma encounters the lives of the people around us, and particularly encounters those with disabilities, that you recognize that although you can't do everything, you can do something, and allow the little that you can do to be enough. And so I want to conclude with a poem that I've written about resiliency. This is a poem about myself, my encounters of being a person who is relatively short in this world, and this poem is really an exploration of resiliency and how the little things in this world can overcome some of the biggest obstacles that are thrown in front of them. And so this is called A Small World. My miniature disposition has been a rather inefficient way to be heard, because you've got to sit tight while I lower the mic before I even say my first word. And even then I'm tiptoeing because I'm not exactly growing to be so self-assured, because I'll never be picked first in basketball. I can't see a thing walking through a crowded hall, and sometimes I'll admit I've got to use the kid-sized urinal stall. And though I may never reach the top kitchen shelf, and I might be called names like midget and shorty and shrimp and elf, I'm starting to like my sense of self. And though I may never jam and lift my hands up over where the basket is, as my mom always told me, dynamite comes in small packages. And truth be told, the real fact is that I believe that the meek will inherit the earth, and that the weak will shame the strong, and that I am a mustard seed baby, and I'm moving mountains all day long. Yes, I will be David in the face of a giant. I will be Daniel in the den of the lions, feeble and yet firm in a fearless defiance. And so this one is for the little guy who's got more bark than he's got bite, yet he will stand and fight the fight. This one is for the little guy who was always picked last, because the last is surpassed when the last won't be least, and the best become beasts, and the fast become feasts, and all those fasts will turn into feasts. And this one is for all those little kids at theme parks that have to hear, well, maybe you'll be tall enough for this ride next year. This is for the guy who had to sit back seat, middle, foot on the hump on every single car ride. This is for the guy who had to severely limit his options on girls he could take to a school dance based primarily on his height. Otherwise, his date would complain that she couldn't wear heels that night. So, in sight of these trite tribulations and despite debilitations, inciting indignation inside of this tried creation, I make no hesitation to reclaim restoration and a little liberation for the underdog salvation. So, if you're small and you're proud, stand up with me right now, because you're not blocking anyone's view here anyhow. So let us rise above our size to meet the eyes of those who push us down. For we were made to humble the proud. We will step up on that stage and silence the crowd, and then they'll adjust the mic from our height, wishing they had such a crutch. For we were trusted in being little, so we were trusted in being much. Though you be little, though you be but one, may you know that you are trusted with much to care for those in our community. Thank you for your time. I'm going to stop the share and see if we have any questions in our remaining moments or minutes together. Would you post the poem? Yeah, I can do that. Jean, do you know where I could post that? You're muted.
We'll send a follow-up email. We could include it in that email.
Okay, yeah, we can do that.
Any other questions for JE? It was a beautiful poem. Way to make me cry right before I'm going to talk. Thank you for your heart for the little guy and the little ones. Yeah. Any questions for JE? I have a question. Oh,
Sure.
there are a couple here. So let's ask those first. Oh, thank you for the poem and thank you for your wisdom sharing, says John Kenzel. And somebody said chat. Is there something in the chat that I'm missing? Nope, I don't think so. Just a thank you from Vicky. So my question was about trauma-informed spaces. I've heard the term trauma-informed spaces, and it seems like if we want to be hospitable to people who have experienced trauma, that we should be creating. I can't hear you, Luis. Can you type in your question? Or maybe I can unmute you. Let's see. Go ahead, Luis. Ask your question. You have, there you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Just a comment about when John, when you said about trauma lives in the shadows,
Mm-hmm.
and I experienced that firsthand because, you know, I have my own trauma, you know, and we don't want to talk about it because we don't want, and I've been sharing this, you know, now that I've been able to open up, you know, to others, we don't want to people asking or wondering, you know, what happened with Luis Padilla, you know, and he has problems. Are you, you know, where is your faith? You know, are you reading the Bible? Are you fasting? Are you praying enough? You know, so we don't want those questions. We don't want to be questioning about our own, you know, faith, you know, because it goes beyond reading the Bible, praying. It goes beyond that. So, and also I want to share something with my counselor, which I've been having sessions for almost 2 years now. And she told me, you know, when I'll be able to go back and do mental health work, I'll be a better therapist because I have been there. I understand better my clients. I understand the suffering, you know, what when someone goes to trauma, because I was there. I am there, you know, like with them. So thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Luis. I'm going to let J.E. respond to that.
Yeah, thank you. First of
your
all, thank
question.
you for your bravery and sharing bits of your story. And I think that you're exactly right, that there's power in people saying that they have that they've been there and opening up and you know, kind of revealing what's been hidden in the shadows. And I think you also make a good point in noting that sometimes we can unintentionally create unsafe spaces for people by maybe pressuring them to share or having a belief that, you know, we don't. Well, I guess we don't have the assumption that, you know, people have experienced trauma and maybe that's why they're responding a certain way. And Jean, you're about to talk about some kind of trauma-informed care and trauma-informed principles. And that's kind of one of the underlying aspects of trauma-informed care and trauma-informed congregations, is starting with the assumption that everybody you encounter might have experienced trauma in their life. Knowing that, keeping that cognizant in our minds might change the way that we respond to people, might change the way that we perceive people rather than experiencing them in some sort of negative tone or negative aspect. We might be able to come with a presumption that maybe they're responding because of a certain trauma that they've encountered. And so what we can do in congregations is develop a model of trauma-informed care that promotes safety. It promotes trustworthiness. There's actually 6 guiding principles that were developed by SAMHSA that highlight the core principles of trauma-informed care. Those are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, not trying to lord power over other people, but actually emphasizing, which is number 5, empowerment, giving people a voice and a choice. And then the last piece is cultural and historical and gender issues, being aware of those and recognizing how those might influence who we're encountering. So those are pieces of trauma-informed care that if we were to use some of those principles as guiding influences in how we cared for everybody, not just people that we assumed were experiencing trauma, then we might promote a much safer and healthier environment for all people who have encountered trauma.
Thanks, J.E. Ann Russell says, amazing. Thank you so much, J.E. Blessing to you and Katie.
Thank you, Anne. It's so good to hear from you. I hope you are well.
And I think that we are at time. I believe that Stan has a little bit of business for us to do. I want to say that I'm grateful to J.E. for sharing your time and your wisdom. And Also grateful to the Church of the Brethren Discipleship Ministries for partnering with us on our webinars. Thanks to Stan, who runs our tech. And thank you all for coming and being here. Really appreciate you being here tonight. Jay has also said he's willing to stay on a little bit longer if people have questions for about 10 more minutes after we're done.
Thank you, J.E. and Jean, for bringing this wonderful content to us this evening, and for the wisdom and passion in which you share this care for folks. For those of you that are interested, this is the link that is just pasted into the chat room, that if you are seeking continuing education as a pastor, or if it is also eligible to you in another profession, that is the link that you need to take and copy and paste in another viewer, and it will take you, fill out the form, and we will make sure that the continuing education certificate is sent to you electronically. Thank you, J.E. Thank you, Jean. It's always a privilege to work together with the Anabaptist Disabilities Network, and God's blessings. And we'll keep this open for a few minutes for continuing interaction.
I wanted to let people know that we do have an issue of Anabaptist Disabilities Network newsletter Connections that's focused on trauma and faith and disability, including some great resources. So I'll include that link to that newsletter when we send out the email, the follow-up email. I have a question. Kirsten Hess says, how to find hope in the midst of hopeless situations?
Well, that's a great question, Karsten. And certainly not easy. And one thing that I would say is that hopeless situations are when we need community, when we can't be alone, so that they can carry the hope for us. Because when we are in a hopeless state, and there truly are hopeless states, there's devastation that we might encounter that can be so overwhelming and so discouraging. And it's in those moments that we're not meant to experience them alone. And it's not necessarily your job as somebody who has experienced trauma to be the finder of hope. Maybe you just need to be in that space and invite other people in who can carry that hope for you, because it is there. Yeah, so that would be my response to that, Karsten. Thanks for asking that very thoughtful question.
Does anybody else have a question for J.E.?
I do have a question. So I was just curious, when you did the exercise earlier this evening, J.E., is some of the tapping and everything, is that informed by neuro-linguistic programming?
That's a big question, Stan, of big words.
I was just wondering, have you had any training or exposure to it? Because that's a similar, I
have not had much training in that specific field of knowledge that comes from. It is certainly informed by neurobiology and an understanding of the brain. It's a theory called bilateral stimulation that is found in numerous practices of therapy, but the one probably most prominent and most evident is known as EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is one of the foremost evidence-based treatments to address trauma. So if, I mean, there are many other modes as well, trauma-focused CBT, mindfulness and mindful self-compassion can also be ways of addressing trauma in a little less, I guess, overwhelming ways that may be a little bit more gentler at times. But EMDR is kind of one of the chief modalities that's recognized by the World Health Federation for addressing trauma. So if you know of somebody who has encountered trauma, or you yourself has encountered trauma and would be interested in engaging in that type of therapy, I would encourage you to check out EMDR, learn a little bit about it. It's a little weird, it's a little different than other forms of talk therapy, but it is evidence-based and a really helpful resource that I myself utilize in my practice. You can go to the website EMDRIA, EMDRIA, to find a therapist in your community, in your area, that might be trained in that type of therapy.
Luis, are you able to type your question or your comment in the chat? That's okay, Luis. You know what? I'm just going to unmute you again. Okay. Oh, here we go. There it is. How much is okay to share about your own mental illness and trauma? And do you have concern with people hearing about your story?
Great question.
Or do you have, I think what he said, do you have to be concerned with people hearing about your story?
Yeah, I think context is really important. The environment in which we share. It has to be a space that is trauma informed. I've seen this happen too much, that people will share their story too much too fast, or in an environment that's unsafe, and it can become a triggering experience or an overwhelming experience, or in itself can be a traumatic experience because you're sharing your story and maybe there's judgment or negative responses that are associated with that. So so there is some concern about when and how you share all parts of your story. So I would encourage you to, if you're wanting to share your story, to practice it first with safe people. Practice it in therapy. A lot of methods, trauma-focused CBT, one of the main outcomes of that is actually writing your own trauma narrative. And so that would be one place to start. And then along with TFCBT is sharing that story in therapy with a caring individual or a supportive person. And so you have somebody there to guide you and guide the person hearing the story also in reflecting that. So that's where I would start. sometimes sharing our own traumas can be triggering to other people. And so how much we share, we have to be kind of cautious with that. So it's important to use our judgment and to get the support of a therapist who knows you, who knows your story as you're navigating through some of those questions. So that's kind of where I would start to advise you, Luis. As you already mentioned that you have some support, you have some therapeutic involvement already, which is awesome. I love hearing that. So I would encourage you to start sharing there. And you know, when it feels safe and with the support of your therapist, to invite other people into that space that you know is safe, where you can start to share that story, and then navigating through that.
Thanks, JE. We are at 10 after 9 Eastern time, and going to let everybody log off and get some rest, but appreciate everyone being here. Appreciate you, JE, of course, again, and the Church of the Brethren for hosting this webinar, and we'll send a follow-up email with some resources.
Thank you
Good
all.
night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.